In the unforgiving winter of 1876, a ruthless band of outlaws made a fatal miscalculation. They threatened a seemingly quiet saloon keeper in the remote mountain town of Evergreen Ridge, never realizing the unassuming man polishing glasses behind the bar was far from ordinary. John Sullivan had once been the deadliest combat tracker in the Native Scout Division, a ghost in the wilderness who could eliminate his target in a dozen different ways without leaving a trace. Before we dive back into this tale, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if this story stirs something in you, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss tomorrow's chapter. I've got something extraordinary lined up just for you. The bitter mountain winds howled through Evergreen Ridge like a pack of hungry wolves, rattling the weathered signs of what was once a bustling mining town. Most businesses had long since boarded up their windows after the copper veins ran dry, leaving behind only the desperate and the dangerous to brave the unrelenting winters. So when John Sullivan arrived with a wagon full of supplies and the deed to the abandoned Elkhorn Saloon, the townsfolk couldn't help but take notice. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the snow-blanketed main street as Sullivan's wagon came to a stop. A man in his early 40s, with dark hair streaked with silver at the temples and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing, stepped down. His movements were deliberate, calculated, almost predatory, but few in Evergreen Ridge would recognize the grace of someone who had spent years navigating hostile enemy territory in complete silence. "If you're here to strike it rich, stranger, you're about 5 years too late," called out Herbert Mills, the elderly general store owner, as he leaned against a post, watching Sullivan unload crates of whiskey and provisions. Sullivan paused only to glance in Mills's direction before resuming his task, his silence as natural as the biting wind that swept through the town. He had learned long ago that words, like bullets, should be used sparingly and with purpose. Third, you'll remember that not all spirits are meant to be bottled. Sullivan released Mackenzie's hand with the same fluid motion he had used to seize it. The scout stumbled back, cradling his wrist, his face contorted in pain and rage. His men hesitated, their hands twitching near their weapons, but the calm authority in Sullivan's stance kept them at bay. His words had carried the weight of someone who didn't bluff, someone who had seen and caused far worse than what these men could imagine. Mackenzie's voice was low and venomous. "This ain't over, barkeep." "No," Sullivan replied evenly, resuming his work behind the bar as though nothing had happened. "It isn't." The gang left in silence, their footsteps heavy on the wooden floor, their retreat marked only by the slamming of the saloon doors. Outside, the sound of their horses' hooves faded into the mountain wind, leaving the street eerily quiet. Freeman stood from his place near the floorboards, hefting his hammer with one massive hand. "Well," he said with a grim smile, "that went about as peaceful as I figured it might." Dr. Hawkins approached the bar, her expression thoughtful as she gathered her medical supplies. "They'll be back," she said, her tone clinical, "and they'll bring more than just words next time." "Good," Sullivan replied, his voice calm but steely. "Let them come." The saloon fell into a tense quiet as the evening stretched on. Sullivan's mind, however, was far from still. Every step, every glance, every word from Mackenzie had confirmed what he already suspected. The Blackwood gang wasn't just testing him. They were sending a message, and Sullivan intended to send one of his own. He opened the hidden compartment beneath the bar, his hand brushing the familiar shape of the Spencer carbine. The weapon's weight was a reminder of his past, a past he had tried to bury. But some debts, as Red Hawk had taught him, could only be paid in full. Sullivan checked the rifle's mechanism, the action smooth and deadly. The ghosts of Fort Henderson whispered to him, their names etched into his memory alongside the faint scent of smoke and blood. As night descended over Evergreen Ridge, the town braced itself for the storm it knew was coming. Shadows deepened, and the wind carried the faint howl of wolves, natural or otherwise. In the Elkhorn Saloon, Sullivan stood alone, his gaze steady and his resolve unshaken. The first round of the fight had ended. The second was about to begin. Sullivan counted 6 riders through the frosted glass, their silhouettes sharp against the snow-covered terrain. The way they moved, calculated, unhurried, spoke volumes. These were no ordinary bounty hunters. They were professionals accustomed to violence, their weapons and gear a stark contrast to the rough-hewn survivalist tools carried by the average outlaw. Mean bunch, indeed, Sullivan murmured, his gaze narrowing as he studied the lead rider. The man carried himself with the cold precision of someone who had killed before and would do so again without hesitation. A distinctive scar ran down the side of his face, disappearing beneath the collar of his coat. Freeman grunted in agreement, his massive arms crossed over his chest. "That one at the front's Jacob Rook," he said, his voice a low growl. "Used to run hunter-killer teams during the war. Heard he made a name for himself south of the border after, hunting anything for the right price." Dr. Hawkins, her medical bag still in hand, frowned as she positioned herself to get a clearer view. "Bounty hunters and the Blackwood gang in the same territory? That's a recipe for chaos. They won't just go after the gang, they'll burn the whole town to the ground if it gets them their quarry." Sullivan continued polishing a glass, his movements steady, his expression unreadable. Chaos is a tool, depending on who wields it. He placed the glass on the bar with care, his mind already calculating the possibilities. These men weren't here by chance. Someone had sent them, and their timing suggested they were tied to the same threads as the Blackwood gang. Through the glass, Rook dismounted with the ease of a predator. He exchanged a few words with his men, gesturing toward the saloon before heading to the sheriff's office. The other riders fanned out, their eyes scanning the town with practiced efficiency. "Message is clear," Freeman said, gripping his hammer. "They're staking their claim. Question is on what?" "The Blackwood gang or something bigger," Sullivan replied, his tone as neutral as ever. But inside, the familiar tension of anticipation coiled. Rook wasn't just a hunter. He was a strategist. His presence raised the stakes, turning the simmering conflict into something far more dangerous. Sullivan glanced at Martha Chun, who had been quietly listening from her usual corner. Her face was pale, but set with determination. "They'll ask questions, Mrs. Chun," he said, his voice low but firm. "Make sure your answers are what they need to hear, and nothing more." She nodded, her hands tightening on the handle of her coffee pot. "I've survived worse, Mr. Sullivan. They won't get anything out of me." The tension in the room thickened as the riders spread through town, their movements measured and deliberate. Freeman hefted his hammer, his knuckles white against the wooden handle. Dr. Hawkins returned to her seat, her eyes darting between the door and the window. "Whatever they're here for," she said quietly, "it's not just the bounty. These men don't work without purpose." Sullivan nodded, his gaze never leaving the street. Purpose is a dangerous thing in hands like theirs. As the riders settled into their positions, Sullivan felt the familiar weight of inevitability pressing down. The arrival of Jacob Rook and his men wasn't just a warning, it was a signal. The quiet before the storm was over. The town of Evergreen Ridge was about to find itself at the center of a battle fought in shadows and blood. And John Sullivan, the ghost of the wilderness, would be waiting. The quiet life Sullivan had hoped to build in Evergreen Ridge was rapidly unraveling, replaced by the tangled web of his past and the threats that now converged on the snow-covered town. The stakes had shifted. It wasn't just about the Blackwood gang anymore. It was about survival against forces with deeper connections and far more experience in hunting prey. Freeman's words hung in the air like a chilling prophecy. Bounty hunters from the north, Blackwood's riders from the south, and us caught in between. Sullivan moved with purpose, his hands steady as he rearranged the saloon's contents. Each bottle, each glass, each length of what had its place, not just for function, but as a calculated part of his defense. The lessons of the Native Scout Division echoed in his mind. Every environment is a battlefield, and every object is a weapon in the right hands. Hayes remained near the bar, fidgeting nervously as he kept watch on the street. "They're after you, aren't they, Mr. Sullivan?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That message, someone's gone through a lot of trouble to find you." Sullivan didn't look up from his task. It was only a matter of time. Secrets don't stay buried forever. Martha Chun, still clutching the coffee pot she hadn't set down, furrowed her brow. "What do they want with you? What could be worth all this?" Sullivan paused, his hand brushing against the medicine pouch beneath. His shirt, inside, the eagle feather and the list of names written in Red Hawk's careful hand felt heavier than ever. "It's not just about me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's about what I know and who I've outlived." Through the window, the snow continued to fall, thick flakes obscuring the shapes moving in the shadows. Sullivan's eyes, sharp and unrelenting, tracked Jacob Rook as he exited the sheriff's office. The bounty hunter moved with the precision of a predator, scanning the street with an instinct honed by years of bloodshed. When their eyes met, the air seemed to freeze. Rook's lips twisted into something between a smirk and a grimace as he touched the scar on his cheek, a silent acknowledgement of the history they shared. "Rook remembers you," Freeman said, his voice low. "That's not a good thing." "No," Sullivan replied, his tone as steady as his hands. "It's not." Dr. Hawkins, seated at a nearby table, sipped her coffee with a calm that belied the tension in her eyes. "Rook's kind don't just hunt people," she said. "They dismantle them. They find weaknesses, exploit them, and leave nothing behind. If he's here, this isn't just a bounty, it's personal. Everything about this is personal," Sullivan murmured, watching as Rook gestured to his men and headed toward the Elkhorn. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing within the saloon. Sullivan glanced at Freeman. "Make sure your hammer's close." His gaze shifted to Dr. Hawkins. "We'll need more than medical supplies before this is over." The saloon door creaked open, and Rook stepped inside, his presence as cold and deliberate as the winter wind that followed him. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on Sullivan for just a moment longer than necessary before he sauntered to the bar. "Nice place you've got here," Rook said, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "A little too nice for a dying town like this." Sullivan finished wiping down the bar and set the cloth aside, meeting Rook's gaze without flinching. "If you're here for a drink, I've got whiskey. If you're here for trouble, you'll leave with more than you came for." Rook's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You always were good with words, Ghost. Let's see if you're still as good with other things." He reached for his Colt. The room tensed, every breath held as. The moment stretched thin. Sullivan's hand hovered near the counter, his movements deliberate but lightning fast. The Native Scout Division had taught him that the key to survival wasn't just speed but control, and control was something he had never lost. The game had changed, but Sullivan was ready to play. The quiet life was over, and the ghosts of his past had come calling. All that remained now was the reckoning. Nodded solemnly, his gaze drifting to the window where the storm continued to blanket the streets of Evergreen Ridge. The names in his medicine pouch weighed heavier now, not just as memories but as obligations, a ledger of debts written in blood and honor. "You're right," he said quietly, turning back to Dr. Hawkins. "Each name is a debt, and Blackwood just added a few more." Her amber eyes held his for a moment, searching. "This isn't just about the gang or the bounty hunters, is it? It's about Fort Henderson, about Red Hawk." Sullivan's jaw tightened, his silence louder than any answer he could give. The memory of Fort Henderson was an open wound, raw and festering. The settlers, the smoke, the screams, it was all tied to Blackwood's greed, and the silent complicity of those in power. And now the architect of that massacre stood poised to repeat history. "Blackwood won't stop until this town is just another graveyard," he said finally. "And Rook? He'll burn the ashes if it gets him his payday." Freeman stepped closer, his hammer resting casually over his shoulder, though there was nothing casual about his expression. "So, what's the play, Sullivan? We sit here and wait for them to tear this place apart." Sullivan glanced at the blacksmith, then at Dr. Hawkins and Martha Chun. They weren't soldiers, but they weren't defenseless either. Freeman's strength, Hawkins's precision, Martha's resolve. They were the kind of people Red Hawk would have called allies. "The play," Sullivan said, his voice like steel, "is to make them think this town isn't worth the fight." Martha frowned, setting down her coffee pot. "And how do we do that with Blackwood's men on one side and Rook's hunters on the other?" Sullivan retrieved a map from behind the bar, spreading it over the counter. The layout of Evergreen Ridge was etched in his mind, each street and building a potential battleground. He pointed to the saloon, then to the sheriff's office, the telegraph station, and the livery stables. "We use the terrain," he said, his voice firm. "Blackwood's men expect fear. Rook expects chaos. We give them neither." Freeman nodded, his lips curving into a grim smile. "You want them fighting each other instead of us." "Exactly," Sullivan said, tapping the map. "Rook's men want the bounty. Blackwood's men want control. They'll tear each other apart if we push them the right way. But we need to hold our ground here." Hawkins's expression turned sharp. "And if they don't take the bait, what then?" Sullivan's hand hovered over his medicine pouch, his fingers brushing the worn leather. "Then we remind them why the wilderness is no place to hunt ghosts." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them like the snow outside. Freeman broke it with a low chuckle. "Guess I'll need more nails for those floorboards. If we're making a stand, might as well make it a good one." Dr. Hawkins glanced at her medical bag, then at Sullivan. "You'll need a medic if this goes south. Don't expect me to stay in the corner while you play hero." Sullivan allowed himself a faint smile. "Wouldn't dream of it, document." Martha straightened her shoulders, her hands steady now. "I'll keep the townsfolk safe, but you better make sure this plan of yours works, Sullivan. If it doesn't, it will," he interrupted, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "It has to." Outside, the snow thickened, muffling the sounds of the town as shadows moved through the storm. Blackwood's men circled like wolves, while Rook's hunters stalked the edges, patient and calculating. The stage was set, and the players were moving into place. Sullivan stood by the window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the growing storm. The quiet life was gone, replaced by the familiar chaos of conflict. But this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about justice. Justice for Fort Henderson, for Red Hawk, and for the people who had trusted him with their lives. He turned back to Freeman, Hawkins, and Martha, his expression resolute. "Let's show them what a ghost can do. Hidden layers of betrayal or higher stakes." The kind of look that suggested Rook's calculations had been upended by forces he didn't fully understand. Sullivan stepped back from the window, his mind racing. Whatever news the courier had delivered, it was significant enough to shake a man like Rook, an experienced predator who thrived in chaos. The question was, what could make someone like him hesitate now? Downstairs, the Elkhorn was a hive of subdued activity. Freeman was double-checking the lines and traps while Hawkins prepared her medical supplies with a precision that spoke of grim expectation. Martha Chun was helping distribute makeshift weapons, hunting rifles, old cavalry sabers, and even a few homemade explosives crafted from mining supplies. Sullivan descended the stairs, his presence drawing the room's attention like gravity. "Hayes, keep watching Rook," he said. "If he moves, I want to know where and why." The young telegraph operator nodded, slipping out through the back door to his observation post. Freeman looked up from where he was securing a bell to one of the lines. "You think the Army's got something to do with this?" Sullivan's lips tightened. "Could be. If Blackwood's bribed the right people, it wouldn't be the first time the Army's turned a blind eye, or worse." Dr. Hawkins set down a tray of bandages, her gaze sharp. "If they're here to interfere, we need to know what side they're on. And fast." Before Sullivan could respond, the saloon doors creaked open, admitting a gust of cold air and old Jack. The Undertaker's grin was as unsettling as ever, but there was a strange intensity in his eyes. "7 graves might not be enough after all," Jack said, his voice low. Words spreading. "Rook's not the only one who got news. Blackwood's riders are on edge too, like wolves smelling a bigger predator." The room fell silent, the weight of Jack's words settling over them. Sullivan's mind worked quickly, piecing together the fragments of information. If both Rook and Blackwood were rattled, it meant an external force was at play, something neither had accounted for. And if that force was powerful enough to disrupt the delicate balance of this deadly standoff, it could either be their salvation or their doom. "Freeman," Sullivan said, his tone decisive, "finish securing the defenses. Hawkins, keep your supplies ready. Martha, get the townsfolk who can fight to the rendezvous point. We'll need every able body if this blows up." "What about you?" Freeman asked, his hammer resting on his shoulder. Sullivan's expression was as cold as the mountain air. "I'm going to find out what message just changed the game." Sullivan moved through the snow-cloaked streets like a shadow, his path carefully chosen to avoid Blackwood scouts and Rook sentries. The town was unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of life muffled by the weight of impending violence. He reached a vantage point overlooking Rook's temporary camp. The bounty hunter's men were gathered around a small fire, their movements tense and watchful. Rook himself stood apart, the courier's message still clutched in his hand. His face was drawn, his scar more pronounced in the flickering light. Sullivan studied the scene, noting the shift in dynamics. Rook wasn't just on edge, he was recalibrating. Whatever the message contained, it had upended his usual confidence. Then he saw it, a small, distinctive seal on the courier's pouch. A symbol he hadn't seen in years, but would never forget. The War Department. Sullivan's breath caught, his pulse quickening. The presence of the War Department in this deadly game meant one thing. This wasn't just about Blackwood, Rook, or even Evergreen Ridge. This was about control, about leverage, about silencing anyone who threatened the balance of power. He slipped back into the shadows, his mind racing. If the War Department was involved, it meant that Blackwood's empire wasn't just a gang's operation, it was part of something much larger. And Sullivan's connection to the Native Scout Division made him a target, not just for revenge, but for elimination. As he made his way back to the Elkhorn, Sullivan's resolve hardened. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing within the town. Tomorrow would bring blood, but it would also bring justice. For Fort Henderson, for Red Hawk, for everyone who had fallen to the greed and corruption that Blackwood and his ilk represented. The ghosts of the wilderness were stirring, and Sullivan was ready to make sure their voices were heard. Realize what my father had become. I didn't want his name to define me, or what I've worked to build here. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, her usual calm replaced with a mixture of anger and fear. Outside, Colonel James Winchester dismounted, his movements precise and deliberate, a predator surveying his prey. Blackwood's men flanked him like a protective wall, their usual arrogance tempered by the imposing presence of the man who now commanded their loyalty. The infamous gang leader, Marcus Blackwood, stood to the side, his usual smugness replaced by deference. This was no longer his show, it was Winchester's. "Freeman," Sullivan said quietly, motioning toward the hidden weapons. "Get everyone ready. This is bigger than we thought." The blacksmith nodded, his massive hands moving with purpose as he secured the tools he'd modified into weapons. Dr. Hawkins steadied herself, forcing her emotions into submission as she began organizing medical supplies. Martha Chin tightened her grip on the brass compass, her knuckles white, as if holding on to it gave her strength. Hayes returned to his post, his young face pale but resolute. "They're positioning themselves for something big," he reported. "Not just a search, they're preparing for a show of force." Sullivan glanced out the window, his sharp eyes noting the methodical way Winchester's forces moved. They weren't just corralling the townsfolk. They were creating a stage, an arena for whatever message Winchester intended to send. "He's here to make an example," Sullivan said, his voice grim. "This isn't just about the package or the evidence. Winchester wants to remind everyone who holds the real power." Dr. Hawkins stepped forward, her gaze fierce. "Then we have to stop him." Sullivan looked at her, seeing not just determination, but something deeper, a reckoning with her past and her family's sins. He nodded, his own resolve hardening. "We will." Through the window, Winchester raised his hand, signaling his men. The townsfolk herded into the square, huddled together, fear etched on their faces. Blackwood's gang stood in a loose perimeter, their weapons ready, but their loyalty now directed toward Winchester. Winchester's voice carried over the cold morning air, calm and commanding. "People of Evergreen Ridge," he began, "I represent interests far greater than your small town. Progress demands sacrifice, and those who resist will find themselves on the wrong side of history." Sullivan felt the weight of those words, the same justification Winchester had used during the war to authorize actions that left scars on the land and the people who lived there. Freeman approached, his hammer resting on his shoulder. "They're making their move. What's the play?" Sullivan looked around at the determined faces of his allies. Freeman, Martha, Dr. Hawkins, even Hayes. He felt the weight of Red Hawk's medicine pouch against his chest, the names within burning like a brand. "We take the fight to them," he said. "Winchester's men think they control the town, but they've underestimated us. They've underestimated what justice means to people who have nothing left to lose." Dr. Hawkins nodded, her voice steady. "Then let's show them what that looks like." The storm may have passed, but a new tempest was brewing, a storm of justice, vengeance, and redemption. And at its center stood John Sullivan, the ghost of the wilderness, ready to pay the debts written in blood and honor, ing his men with the precision of a battlefield commander. The flames illuminated his cold expression as he barked orders, driving the methodical destruction of Evergreen Ridge. Sullivan's team moved quickly through the back alleys, shadows cloaking their retreat. Sarah's face was pale but determined, her medical bag clutched tightly. Martha held the compass as if it were a lifeline, while Hayes limped along, supported by Freeman's broad shoulders. The blacksmith's modified tools clinked faintly against his belt as he guided them toward the church. "We have to get there before they do," Sullivan said, his voice a low growl. "Whatever Red Hawk hid, it's the key to stopping this madness." The church loomed ahead, its steeple silhouetted against the fiery sky. Though long abandoned, it stood as a sentinel over the town, its crumbling walls now there. Only hope. Freeman guided them to a concealed entrance at the rear, an old maintenance hatch partially buried under snow. "This will lead to the crypts," he said, his voice steady. Lee mentioned it once, said the church was built over an old tribal site. Sullivan nodded, motioning for everyone to follow. The group descended into the darkness, their footsteps echoing off stone walls. The air grew colder, the oppressive silence broken only by the muffled sounds of battle above. The crypt smelled of damp earth and decay. The flickering light of their lantern revealed faded tribal markings etched into the walls, a stark contrast to the Christian symbols above. Martha traced her fingers over the carvings, her voice barely a whisper. This was sacred ground long before the settlers came. Sullivan's eyes scanned the room, his mind piecing together Red Hawk's intent. The compass's markings matched some of the carvings, forming a pattern that led to a stone slab in the center of the crypt. Kneeling, he pressed the compass into a recessed groove. With a grinding sound, the slab shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a weathered leather pouch. Sullivan opened it carefully, revealing documents, maps, and a small carved totem. The papers bore military insignias alongside tribal seals, detailing secret agreements, troop movements, and orders signed by Winchester himself. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Proof of everything. Fort Henderson, the massacres, the corruption." Freeman inspected the totem, his brow furrowing. "And this? What does it mean?" "It's a warning," Sullivan said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Red Hawk left this to remind us of the cost of forgetting our humanity. It's not just evidence, it's a call to action." A distant explosion shook the crypt, dust falling from the ceiling. Hayes looked up nervously. "They're getting closer." Sullivan stood, the pouch secured under his coat. "Then we make our stand here." The group worked quickly, preparing defenses with the precision Sullivan had learned in the Native Scout Division. Freeman reinforced the entrance with heavy stones, while Sarah and Martha organized their supplies. Hayes set up a makeshift communication station, ready to send a coded message if they could find an opportunity. As the first shouts echoed through the crypt's entrance, Sullivan gripped his rifle tightly. The names in Red Hawk's medicine pouch felt heavier than ever, each one a reminder of the sacrifices made to bring them to this moment. "Winchester wants to bury the truth," Sullivan said, his voice steady. "But not today." With the sound of approaching footsteps, the final battle for Evergreen Ridge began. "And he was doing at Fort Henderson," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mix of horror and anger. "It wasn't just about clearing land for the railroad. He was testing weapons, erasing lives to perfect his tools of war." Sullivan's jaw tightened as he followed the trail of symbols to another hidden compartment in the chamber wall. With practiced hands, He pressed a sequence of pressure points that caused the stone to slide open, revealing a small chest bound with weathered leather. Inside were more documents, maps, and an object wrapped in a faded cloth. Martha carefully unwrapped the cloth, revealing a carved eagle feather, its edges lined with delicate tribal etchings. Red Hawk's personal mark, she whispered. This was his symbol of hope and defiance. The documents, however, held the true weight of the moment. Detailed records of Winchester's orders, weapon tests, and payments from private corporations filled the chest, alongside accounts of the massacres and names of the dead. The final pages were letters from Red Hawk, addressed to the future, urging whoever found them to bring the truth to light. Sullivan closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the names in his medicine pouch heavier than ever. Red Hawk had known this day would come, had trusted that justice would find its way to those with the courage to act. These documents are everything we need, Hayes said, his voice shaking. Proof of everything Winchester has done. But how do we get them out of here? He won't stop until we're all dead. We don't run, Sullivan said firmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced death too many times to falter now. We stand and we fight. Freeman nodded, gripping one of his modified tools. The tunnels give us an advantage. Narrow spaces, limited visibility. We can hold them off here. Sarah looked at Sullivan, her eyes filled with resolve. If we can get the documents out of this town, we can expose him. Everything he's built will collapse. A distant explosion echoed through the tunnels, closer this time. The sound of boots and shouted orders grew louder, signaling that Winchester's men were closing in. Sullivan glanced at Martha, who still held the compass and the feather. You know these tunnels better than anyone, he said. Find the safest route to the surface and take the documents with you. Hayes, go with her. Your knowledge of codes will be crucial. What about you? Hayes asked, fear and determination battling in his expression. Sullivan's gaze hardened. We hold the line. Freeman, Sarah, and I will buy you the time you need. Martha hesitated, her grip tightening on the compass. Sullivan, if we fail, you won't, Sullivan interrupted, his voice steady. Red Hawk didn't die for nothing. Neither will we. As Martha and Hayes disappeared into the shadows, Sullivan turned to Freeman and Sarah. They'll come at us hard, but we've got the advantage. Freeman, set traps along the narrow points. Sarah, prepare for casualties. We'll need you to keep us on our feet. And you? Sarah asked, her voice soft but firm. Sullivan checked his rifle and the knife strapped to his belt. I'll be the ghost they taught me to be. The echoes of the enemy's advance grew louder, the flicker of torchlight dancing on the stone walls. Sullivan's team moved into position, their determination forged in the crucible of loss and purpose. As the first of Winchester's men entered the chamber, Sullivan's voice echoed through the tunnels, calm and cold. You're my world now. The battle for truth had begun, and the legacy of Red Hawk would not be silenced. Destroy the evidence and leave nothing behind, Sullivan said grimly, reloading his carbine. The heat from the spreading fire mixed with the acrid smell of gunpowder, creating a suffocating atmosphere in the ancient burial chamber. Martha clutched the compass tighter, her eyes scanning the symbols once more. There's another way out, she said suddenly, her voice steady despite the chaos. Red Hawk marked it here. She pointed to a faint engraving on the far wall, partially obscured by debris. It leads through an older section of the tunnels, away from the church. Take the documents and go, Sullivan ordered. We'll cover you. Martha hesitated, looking at the others. What about you? Sullivan's gaze was firm, unyielding. We'll hold them off. This truth has to survive, no matter what. Freeman's massive frame loomed beside him, his modified weapons ready. We'll give him hell, the blacksmith growled. You just make sure that evidence sees the light of day. Hayes moved to help. Martha gathered the documents, his face pale but determined. We won't let their sacrifice be for nothing, he said, gripping his revolver tightly. As Martha and Hayes slipped into the hidden passage, Sarah hesitated. I'm staying, she said firmly, her eyes meeting Sullivan's. This is my fight too. You might not get another chance to leave, Sullivan warned. Neither did the families at Fort Henderson, she replied. Her voice carried a quiet resolve that reminded Sullivan of Red Hawk. I won't abandon this fight. Sullivan nodded, respecting her choice. Then we hold the line. The sound of boots and shouted orders grew louder as Winchester's men regrouped, their disciplined movements betraying their military training. The flames crept closer, illuminating the chamber in a hellish glow. Winchester won't stop, Freeman said, his voice low. This isn't just about the documents. It's personal for him now. It always was, Sullivan replied. He's trying to erase everything, his crimes, his failures, even the people who knew the truth. The first wave of soldiers entered the chamber, their weapons drawn. Sullivan fired, his shots precise and deadly, forcing the attackers to scatter. Freeman's traps did the rest, taking out several men as they triggered hidden tripwires and explosive charges. Winchester's voice echoed through the tunnels, cold and commanding. Enough of this. Finish them. Mackenzie appeared through the smoke, his injured hand bound but still clutching a revolver. His hatred burned brighter than the flames. You think you can stop us, Scout? He sneered. You're just a relic of a war no one remembers. Sullivan stepped forward, his rifle aimed squarely at Mackenzie. Relics have a way of outlasting the people who underestimate them. The shot rang out, echoing through the chamber. Mackenzie dropped to his knees, his weapon clattering to the ground. Sullivan's aim never wavered as he moved to cover Freeman and Sarah. The battle raged on, each moment a desperate struggle against overwhelming odds. But Sullivan's training, Freeman's ingenuity, and Sarah's unwavering determination turned the tide. As the flames consumed the chamber, Sullivan knew they were running out of time. Freeman, take Sarah and go, he ordered. I'll hold them here. I'm not leaving you, Sarah protested. You have to, Sullivan said, his voice firm. This fight isn't about me. It's about the truth. Go. Freeman placed a massive hand on Sarah's shoulder. Come on, document. We can't let his sacrifice be for nothing. Reluctantly, Sarah followed Freeman into the hidden passage, her heart heavy with the weight of what they were leaving behind. Sullivan stood alone as Winchester entered the chamber, his face a mask of cold fury. You think this changes anything, Scout? Winchester sneered. Burn the evidence, kill the witnesses, and the world will forget. Sullivan raised his rifle, his expression calm and resolute. Some truths can't be buried, Winchester. Not by you, not by anyone. The final confrontation began, a battle of wills and skill that would determine the fate of everything Red Hawk had died to protect. Recognizing the colonel's tactics, if you couldn't secure a position, deny it to the enemy, even if that meant destroying sacred ground. Sarah worked frantically to protect the documents as smoke began filling the chamber. These prove everything: the weapons test, the massed massacres, the corporate connection, names, dates, photographs, none of it matters if we don't survive to reveal it. Hayes coughed, reloading his revolver with shaking hands through the growing haze. Sullivan spotted movement. Winchester himself entering the chamber, flanked by his elite guards. The colonel's uniform was immaculate despite the chaos, his manner still commanding. I trained you better than this, Winchester called out, his voice carrying that same reasonable tone he'd used when ordering atrocities. Cornered underground with limited ammunition, Red Hawk's influence made you sloppy. Red Hawk taught us what you couldn't, Sullivan replied, using the exchange to mask his movement between positions, about honor, about justice, about the difference between following orders and following conscience. Winchester almost laughed. Look around you, the railway is coming, the mines are expanding, the old ways are dying. Men like us, we either shape that change or were crushed by it. A burst of gunfire forced Sullivan into cover. Winchester's men were good professional soldiers disguised as common outlaws, but they weren't scouts. They hadn't learned to move like ghosts, to strike from shadows. You're wrong, father, Sarah's voice carried clearly despite the chaos. The old ways aren't dying, they're waiting like this evidence waited, like justice waits more. Explosions rocked the chamber as Freeman's charges continued their work. Support beams groaned ominously as fire spread across the ceiling. The entire underground complex was becoming unstable. Martha Sullivan called out, we need that exit. She studied the compass's markings one final time, understanding dawning in her eyes. Of course, it's not about finding a new way out, it's about using what's already here. She pointed to a partially collapsed alcove that's not decay. Those breaks are deliberate tribal stonework patterns. Sullivan saw it too, how the apparent random damage actually formed a recognizable pattern, one that Red Hawk had taught them to recognize, about how destruction could hide creation. Hey Sarah, get those documents ready to move. Martha, keep tracking those patterns. Sullivan checked his ammunition. Not much left, but enough. I'll handle the Colonel. Winchester's voice cut through smoke and gunfire, still trying to play the hero scout. How many more have to die for your outdated ideals? That's the difference between us, Sullivan replied, moving into position for one final confrontation. You see death as a tool, we see it as a debt that must be paid. The chamber had become an inferno, flames spreading across ancient timbers as two forces maneuvered for final advantage. Above them, through gaps in the burning ceiling, came the sounds of Rook's men engaging Winchester's forces in the streets of Evergreen Ridge. The time for shadows and secrets was ending. Now came the moment of truth and fire. Beneath sacred ground where old debts would finally be settled, the burial chamber had become an inferno, flames racing across ancient timbers as smoke filled every corner. Through the chaos, Sullivan moved like a ghost, using techniques Red Hawk had taught him for fighting in zero visibility. Each shot from his Spencer carbine was precise, deliberate, not wasting precious ammunition. Winchester's men were professionals, but they weren't prepared for these conditions. The combination of smoke, unstable footing, and the chamber's confusing acoustics worked against their military training. Meanwhile, Sullivan used every trick the native scouts had developed for unconventional warfare. The pattern continues here, Martha called out, tracing symbols on the chamber's far wall. Despite the chaos, her hands remained steady on Red Hawk's compass. These cracks, they're not random. They're showing us something. Sarah worked frantically to preserve the evidence, wrapping documents in her medical bags, waterproof lining these records. The weapons tests weren't just about military efficiency. They were experiments testing how different tribes would react under specific types of attack. Scientific progress requires data. Winchester's voice carried through the smoke, still maintaining that reasonable tone. The railway is coming. The mines are expanding. Better a few control tests than widespread chaos. A support beam crashed down, sending sparks and burning debris across the chamber. Hayes barely dodged in time, protecting the precious documents. Got everything vital, he reported through coughs, names, dates, photographs, enough to expose it all. You still don't understand, Winchester called out as his men maneuvered through the smoke. These papers, Red Hawk's evidence, their meaningless progress doesn't answer to justice, it answers to power and money. Why do you think the Army classified the Scout Division's records? Why do you think they let us operate without oversight? Sullivan moved positions again, using the conversation to mask his movement. The native scouts had taught him that sometimes the best weapon was making your enemy talk, revealing their position through their own arrogance. Because men like you convinced them it was necessary, Sullivan replied, his voice seemingly coming from multiple directions. Fed them lies about military necessity, about civilizing the frontier, while you lined your pockets with blood money. More gunfire erupted as Winchester's men spotted movement in the smoke, but Sullivan was already gone, leaving only shadows. The chamber's layout had become a maze of fire and falling debris, transforming the sacred burial ground into a hellish battlefield. The tribal elders saw this coming, Martha said, suddenly understanding dawning in her eyes as she studied the compass's markings. That's what the ghost dance was really about, not just resistance. Prophecy about a time when hidden things would be revealed, when balance would be restored. Superstitious nonsense, Winchester scoffed, but there was an edge to his voice. Now Red Hawk filled your heads with tribal mysticism when you should have been focusing on military precision. He taught us to see what you couldn't, Sullivan replied, using the chamber's acoustics to mask his position. The connections between things, the patterns, like how a corrupt officer leaves tracks just like any other prey. A massive explosion rocked the chamber from above. Rook's men still fighting Winchester's forces in the burning town. The shock wave dislodged more debris, causing ancient support beams to groan ominously. Sarah, Winchester called out, a note of genuine concern finally cracking his composure. This isn't you. You're a doctor, a woman of science. You understand the need for controlled progress. I understand the difference between progress and atrocity. She shot back, securing the last of the documents. Something you never learned, Father. Something these records prove. Mackenzie's voice carried through the smoke, pain making it savage. Sir, the support structures are failing. We need to pull back. But Winchester wasn't finished. You think exposing this change is anything? The railway's already bought beams groaned under the weight of collapsing stone, the air thick with heat and ash. Sullivan's voice carried through the chaos, steady and unyielding. But Red Hawk saw through you, and so do we. This isn't progress, it's destruction. Justice is coming, Winchester. It always does. Winchester stepped forward into the flickering firelight, his pistol raised, his face a mask of fury and desperation. You think you're a hero, Sullivan? You're nothing. A relic clinging to dead ideals. This world doesn't care about justice, only power. Sullivan moved like a shadow, using the crumbling chamber to his advantage, his rifle at the ready. Maybe, he replied, his tone calm, but power like yours always burns out, just like this town. Hayes's voice crackled from deeper in the tunnels, where Sarah and Freeman were securing the last of the evidence. Sullivan, we've got the documents ready to move. Freeman's rigged the passage to seal behind us. Sullivan's gaze never left Winchester. Go, he shouted back. I'll handle this. Winchester sneered. You won't make it out of here alive, Scout. Maybe not, Sullivan said, his voice as quiet and dangerous as the mountains he had once scouted. But I don't need to. This isn't about me. With a sudden movement, Sullivan fired, his shot forcing Winchester to dive for cover. The colonel retaliated, his precision impeccable, but Sullivan had already disappeared into the shadows. The scout's movements were fluid, unpredictable, ghost-like. The battle became a deadly game of cat and mouse, each man anticipating the other's next move. Winchester barked commands to his remaining men, but the collapsing chamber and Freeman's traps made communication chaotic. Sullivan, meanwhile, used every lesson Red Hawk had taught him, exploiting Winchester's overconfidence and reliance on control. As the fire consumed more of the chamber, Winchester's arrogance faltered. His men were outmaneuvered, his plans unraveling. You don't understand, he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. This isn't just about me. It's bigger than you or Red Hawk. Without me, this entire system collapses. Good, Sullivan replied, emerging from the shadows to deliver a shot that shattered Winchester's pistol, sending it clattering to the ground. Maybe it's time for the system to collapse. Winchester staggered, unarmed, but still defiant. You can't stop progress, Sullivan. Progress. Sullivan's voice was like steel. Red Hawk called it something else, corruption. The colonel lunged, drawing a concealed knife, but Sullivan was faster. With a move born of years of training, he disarmed Winchester, the knife clattering to the ground. Sullivan pressed the barrel of his rifle to Winchester's chest, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. You killed Red Hawk. You burned Fort Henderson. You murdered families to hide your crimes, Sullivan said, his voice cold and steady. This ends here. Winchester stared into Sullivan's eyes, his composure finally cracking. You think killing me changes anything? You think anyone cares? Sullivan didn't reply. He didn't need to. The names in the medicine pouch pressed against his chest reminded him why he had to do this, why justice demanded it. But he didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he stepped back. You're not worth it, he said, lowering his rifle. The truth will bury you deeper than any bullet ever could. Before Winchester could react, another explosion rocked the chamber, this one from Freeman's rigged charges. Stone and fire collapsed between them, cutting off Sullivan's escape route and leaving Winchester to face the burning chamber alone. Sullivan turned and ran toward the hidden exit where Freeman and the others waited. Behind him, the chamber collapsed entirely, the roar of falling stone and Winchester's final, echoing scream swallowed by the flames. Outside, the first light of dawn broke over Evergreen Ridge. The town was battered, but the people were safe. Rook's men had secured the streets, and Sarah stood with Freeman and Hayes, clutching the documents that would expose everything. Sullivan emerged from the tunnels, his face streaked with soot, but his eyes sharp. He handed the compass back to Martha. Red Hawk's truth is out now, he said. The rest is up to all of you. As the sun rose over the smoldering ruins, the people of Evergreen Ridge began to rebuild. Not just their town, but the hope that justice could still prevail. Was a mix of relief and sorrow as she absorbed the news. Despite everything her father had done, he was still the man who had raised her, and his death marked the end of a chapter she'd tried to leave behind. Justice, she said softly, clutching her medical bag filled with damning evidence. At a cost, but it's finally here. Martha Chin approached, the compass still in her hands. Lee believed in this, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. He knew the truth would outlive them all. Freeman joined them, his massive frame bearing the weight of exhaustion, but his eyes glinting with determination. We've got survivors to help and a town to rebuild, he said, his voice a calming presence amidst the chaos. What's next, Sullivan? Sullivan glanced around, taking in the ruins of Evergreen Ridge, the soldiers gathering the townspeople, and the rising sun that cast long shadows over the battlefield. The weight of Red Hawk's teachings, the names in his medicine pouch, and the lives lost in the name of greed and progress hung heavy in his mind. Now, he said quietly, we make sure this never happens again. Hayes, despite his injuries, stepped forward. The evidence is already on its way to the territorial capitals. Once it reaches the courts, there's no stopping it. Rook gave a rare smile, though it was tinged with fatigue. Winchester thought he could control everything, but in the end, the truth slipped through his fingers. Poetic, isn't it? Sullivan nodded, but said nothing. He knew the fight wasn't over. Corruption like Winchester's didn't vanish with a single victory. It would take vigilance and courage to keep the truth alive and to protect the fragile hope they had ignited. As the group began to disperse to tend to the wounded and organize the evidence, Sullivan lingered near the edge of town, gazing out over the mountains. The names in his medicine pouch felt lighter now, the debts paid in full. But he knew there would always be more battles, more truths to uncover, and more ghosts demanding justice. For now, though, Evergreen Ridge had won its reprieve. The people had stood together, and in doing so, they had reclaimed their town, their dignity, and their future. As the first rays of sunlight touched the snow-covered peaks, Sullivan turned back toward the town. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a man with a purpose, and there was still work to be done. Resolute, Evergreen Ridge had been scarred, but its spirit remained unbroken. The townspeople gathered in small groups, helping each other rebuild, both physically and emotionally. Despite the destruction, there was a sense of unity that hadn't existed before, a bond forged in shared suffering and the collective fight for justice. Freeman stood tall near the blacksmith shop, now little more than smoldering ruins. This town will rise again, he declared, his voice carrying over the murmurs. Not for the railway or the mining companies, but for us, for everyone who refused to bow to greed and corruption. Sarah joined him, her medical supplies replenished by the arriving military medics. We'll rebuild together, she added, but we'll do it right this time. No more compromises, no more sacrifices for progress that doesn't serve the people. Martha held the wrapped compass close, her gaze on the horizon. Lee's dream wasn't just about exposing the truth, she said softly. It was about giving people the power to stand up for themselves, to demand better. That's what we have to hold on to. Rook, leaning against a post with a rifle slung over his shoulder, gave a grim nod. This isn't the end of the fight. There'll always be another Winchester, another Blackwood. But at least now, folks know they can win. Sullivan stood slightly apart, his eyes scanning the streets as soldiers and investigators continued their work. He had always known that the fight for justice was never truly over, but today was a victory, a hard-fought moment of triumph for those who had given everything. Hayes approached, a hint of a smile breaking through his tired expression. Messages are going out faster than they can stop them. Papers are already printing headlines about the Battle of Evergreen Ridge. People are going to know what happened here. Sullivan finally spoke, his voice low but steady. It's not just about what happened. It's about what comes next. This town, these people, they've earned the right to decide their future. And so has everyone who stood with them. As the sun rose higher, melting the last traces of snow and smoke, Evergreen Ridge began to stir with the sounds of renewal. Hammering, voices calling out, the laughter of children who had survived to see another day. It was a start. Sullivan turned to the group. Sarah, Martha, Freeman, Hayes, and even Rook. This isn't goodbye, he said. There'll be more battles, more truths to uncover. But for now, we've done what we came here to do. Martha reached out, placing the compass in his hand. Take it, she said. You'll know when it's needed again. Sullivan nodded, slipping the compass into his coat alongside the medicine pouch. Red Hawk believed in balance, he said. Today we honored that. Now it's up to us to keep it. As the group dispersed to continue their work, Sullivan lingered for a moment, watching the town slowly come back to life. He thought of Red Hawk, of Lee Chun, of all the names in his pouch, and of the ones that would never be forgotten. Justice had found its way to Evergreen Ridge, and the ghosts could rest, for now. But Sullivan knew that as long as there were truths to uncover and debts to be paid, he would remain ready, a ghost in the wilderness, watching over those who fought for what was right. Spanned years and touched every corner of the frontier. The headlines in major newspapers called it the Frontier Conspiracy, exposing how greed and power had masqueraded as progress at the expense of countless lives. The people of Evergreen Ridge began to rebuild, not just their homes, but their sense of community. The Saloon, once a symbol of faded dreams, became a gathering place again, not for despair, but for hope. Freeman's blacksmith forge was one of the first businesses restored, his massive hands crafting tools and reinforcing structures that would stand against the harshest winters. Martha Chin took on a new role as the town's unofficial historian, preserving the story of what had happened, ensuring that the names of the lost would not be forgotten. She kept Lee's notes and Red Hawk's compass in a glass case in the church, now rebuilt as a place of both worship and remembrance. Sarah Hawkins, her father's shadow no longer looming over her, stayed in Evergreen Ridge to oversee the town's medical needs. Her reputation grew, not just as a healer, but as someone who had stood for justice when it mattered most. She became a voice for accountability, ensuring that the lessons of the past shaped the future. Hayes, once a quiet telegraph operator, became a key figure in spreading the truth. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the evidence collected in Evergreen Ridge reached the right hands, fueling investigations and tribunals across the territories. The young man who had once relayed messages in secret was now a recognized symbol of courage and resilience. Rook and his bounty hunters lingered only long enough to see justice delivered. The grizzled man left behind a message for Sullivan before riding out. Sometimes the wolves and the shepherds are the same. But this time, we were on the right side. Sullivan remained in the town longer than expected, helping Freeman and Sarah rebuild, his presence a quiet reassurance to a community that had endured so much. But he knew his time there was temporary. The compass and the pouch of names reminded him of trails yet to follow, battles yet to fight. One morning, as the first snows of the new winter began to fall, he packed his belongings and prepared to leave. The townspeople gathered to see him off, their gratitude evident in their faces. You've given us more than we could ever repay, Martha said, her voice steady but emotional. Sullivan shook his head. This town saved itself. I was just here to help you see it. Sarah stepped forward, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. Where will you go? She asked. Wherever I'm needed, he replied. There are always trails to follow. Freeman clapped him on the shoulder, his massive hand a symbol of the strength they had built together. You've got a place here, Sullivan, anytime. With a nod, Sullivan mounted his horse, the compass tucked safely in his coat. As he rode away, the sound of hammers and voices echoed behind him. A town rebuilding, not just for survival, but for a better future. The road ahead was uncertain, but Sullivan knew one thing for sure. Red Hawk's teachings, the names in the medicine pouch, and the lessons of Evergreen Ridge would guide him. Justice, like the trails of the frontier, had no end. It was a journey, and he was still walking it. Forgotten, Sullivan stood at the edge of town, watching as the tribal representatives began their ceremonies. The rhythmic beats of the drums seemed to echo through the valley, blending with the rebuilding sounds of Evergreen Ridge. The town was changing, evolving into something stronger, more resilient, a testament to those who had fought for its survival. Sarah joined him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. They're saying this could be the start of something bigger, she said, nodding toward the tribal gathering. A new alliance between the councils and territorial governments. More oversight, more cooperation. Maybe, Sullivan replied, his tone cautious. But alliances can be fragile. The truth might be out now, but keeping it alive will take constant vigilance. Sarah's gaze shifted to the compass Martha had carefully wrapped and stored. Red Hawk believed in balance, she said softly, between old ways and new. Maybe that's what this is, a chance to find it. Behind them, Hayes emerged from the telegraph office, his coat still torn from the night's battle, but his posture proud. Message just came through, he announced. Federal investigators are opening inquiries into 3 other territories. They're calling it the Winchester effect. Freeman joined them, wiping soot from his hands as he surveyed the activity in the streets. Town's got a long way to go, he said, his deep voice thoughtful. But people are starting to believe they can make it better. That's something. Martha approached with a bundle of papers, her hand steady despite the weight of the memories they carried. These are for the investigators, she said, her voice resolute. Lee gave his life for this truth. It's time the world sees it. Sullivan nodded, his respect for the group around him evident. They had each played a role in this battle, not just for Evergreen Ridge, but for something larger, a reckoning for the frontier itself. Rook appeared, his ever-present scar catching the light. Got word from my contacts, he said. There's more work out there, more towns, more buried secrets. Could use a man like you, Ghost. Sullivan shook his head, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Not yet. There's still work here. The others looked at him, understanding his meaning. Sullivan wasn't just staying to see the rebuilding through. He was staying to ensure that the lessons learned here weren't forgotten. As the sun began to set over the valley, casting long shadows over the town, the drums of the tribal ceremonies continued. Their rhythm was a reminder of resilience, of balance, and of the promise that justice, once found, could reshape even the most hardened frontier. Evergreen Ridge had become a symbol, not just of survival, but of hope. And for Sullivan, it was a step on a longer journey, one where the truth would always need protectors, and justice would always need champions. The story concludes with a poetic reflection on the journey of justice, resilience, and renewal in the frontier. It leaves the audience with a sense of accomplishment and hope, underscoring the importance of balance between progress and preservation. The renaming of Evergreen Ridge to 2 roads meeting signifies the convergence of old and new, wisdom and innovation, a fitting metaphor for the lessons learned throughout the story. Sullivan, carrying both the compass and the medicine pouch, embodies the merging of these worlds, taking up Red Hawk's mantle to ensure justice continues to find its way, like water through stone. This ending invites reflection while leaving room for the continuation of the larger fight against corruption and greed, suggesting that while the battle for Evergreen Ridge may be over, the war for justice and balance is far from finished. It's a powerful close that resonates with the idea of collective effort and the enduring power of truth. If you'd like, I can craft a shorter synopsis or explore specific aspects further. Just let me know.